problem with being the most promising young curator in Manhattan was that everyone expected you to smile through it. Letitia Moretti had been smiling for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew because she'd checked her watch every time the smile started to crack, every time someone pressed a champagne flute into her palm and said, "You must be so proud," with that particular brand of enthusiasm that lives just 1 degree north of envy. The flute in her hand now was her 3rd. Or maybe her 4th. She'd stopped counting somewhere between the investment banker who called her work accessible, an insult dressed in a compliment's clothing, and the gallery owner from the Upper East Side who suggested, in a voice like velvet over granite, that she might consider softening the political edge of her next exhibition if she ever wanted to be taken seriously by the foundations that, actually, mattered. She had smiled at that too. Letitia Moretti, 29 years old, daughter of a Milanese architect and a Brazilian schoolteacher, raised between São Paulo and Rome, and finally planted in New York like a seedling that had been transplanted so many times she'd forgotten which soil felt like home. She'd earned her position at Whitmore Contemporary through 6 years of unglamorous work, cataloging, grant writing, cold-calling artists in languages she'd half-learned from YouTube tutorials. And she wore her title, Senior Curatorial Associate, the way someone wears a piece of armor they've forged themselves. With pride, yes, but also with the full knowledge of every dent it cost them. The party was called Luminance, which told you everything you needed to know about the people who organized it. It was held in a rooftop penthouse in Tribeca, belonging to someone whose name Letitia couldn't be bothered to remember, only that he had inherited a media empire and now fancied himself an art patron, which in practice meant throwing extremely expensive parties and calling them cultural events. The aesthetic was deliberately underground chic, bare concrete floors softened by Persian rugs, neon signs in pink and electric blue, casting everyone in the kind of light that made beauty look effortless and effort look beautiful. A DJ in the corner played Berlin techno at a volume that allowed conversation but discouraged thought, which was, Letitia suspected, entirely by design. She was here because Leo had insisted. CTA. If you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, or you just believe real love is always worth the risk, hit like and subscribe. This story is just getting started. Leo Thorne was her best friend in the way that only someone who has seen you cry in an airport bathroom at 2 a.m. can truly be your best friend. Completely, without conditions, with the particular intimacy that comes from shared embarrassment and mutual survival. They'd met at Columbia, in a film theory seminar that neither of them needed for their degree, but both attended for the professor, a tiny Argentinian woman who wore her hair in a bun, the size of a grapefruit, and had opinions about Godard so violent they bordered on performance art. Leo was studying architecture. Letitia was doing her master's in art history. They'd ended up at the same bar after the first session and argued about cinematic space for 3 hours, and by the end of the night, something had been established between them that felt less like friendship and more like recognition. The specific shock of meeting someone who thinks the way you think, only from a completely different direction. That had been 7 years ago. Now Leo was a rising architect with a firm in Soho and cheekbones that made strangers stop mid-sentence, and he moved through parties like Luminance with the easy confidence of a man who understood exactly how rooms worked because he spent his professional life designing them. He'd spotted her 20 minutes ago across the penthouse, made a face that said, "You're doing great, keep going," and then been swallowed by a cluster of people who wanted to talk to him about a new mixed-use development in Bushwick. She was on her own, which was fine. Letitia was good at being on her own at parties. She'd developed a technique. Find something to look at, a painting, an architectural detail, a view, and position yourself in front of it with your drink at a contemplative angle, so that you appear to be engaged with the space rather than simply untethered within it. It bought you time. It bought you silence. And in a room full of people who talked primarily to be heard, silence was a form of power. Tonight, the thing to look at was the city. Manhattan spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass panels like a promise someone had made in the dark and kept for 100 years. Relentless, luminous, stupidly beautiful. Letitia pressed her fingers against the glass and felt the cold of it travel up through her palm, and she thought, not for the first time, that cities are the only thing humans have built that manages to be both completely real and completely metaphorical at the same time. A city is a fact and a feeling simultaneously. She'd tried to say this once at a dinner party, and a man had told her it sounded like something that would be written on a tote bag, which she supposed was a valid critique, and also entirely missed the point. "The Kessler piece is underpriced," said a voice somewhere to her left. She turned. A man she vaguely recognized. Tech money, she thought, or possibly private equity, was gesturing at a canvas hanging between two neon signs, a large-scale abstract in deep burgundy and gold that Letitia had spent approximately 4 seconds evaluating when she arrived and had filed under competent but derivative. The man was speaking to a woman in a white blazer who was nodding with the practiced enthusiasm of someone whose job required her to agree with wealthy people. "Significantly underpriced," the man continued. "I've been watching Kessler for 2 years. He's going to be the next." Letitia stopped listening. Not from rudeness, but from the particular mercy the brain extends to itself when it recognizes that engagement with a conversation will only produce frustration. She turned back to the window. The party pressed against her back like a warm, indifferent hand. She was deciding, with the quiet precision of someone who has made this particular decision many times before, whether to stay another 45 minutes, enough to have been seen, enough to justify the cab fare and the heels, or to leave now and accept the mild social penalty of early departure when she noticed the door to the terrace. It was propped open with what appeared to be someone's abandoned stiletto, and through the gap came a thin ribbon of night air that cut through the warm press of bodies and music like a clean line drawn through noise. Letitia felt it against her collarbone and made her decision in approximately half a second. She excused herself from no one, set her champagne on the nearest surface, a shelf holding a bronze sculpture of ambiguous intent, and walked toward the door. The terrace was small by Manhattan rooftop standards, maybe 30 feet by 20, bordered by a waist-high concrete parapet, and strung with Edison bulbs that someone had thought to turn off, so that the only light came from the city below and the faint pulse of the neon signs leaking through the glass behind her. The rain had begun sometime in the last hour. Not a real rain, more of a suggestion of rain, the kind that barely registers on skin, but gradually makes everything faintly luminous. Surfaces catching light they'd been holding back all evening. Letitia stepped out and let the door fall almost shut behind her. The sound of the party dropped from a roar to a murmur. The air tasted like wet concrete in distance. She exhaled. It was the first real breath she'd taken in 4 hours. She hadn't realized how thoroughly she'd been holding herself together inside. Shoulders leveled, jaw soft, eyes calibrated to alert but approachable. Until the tension released, and she felt it leave her body like something physical, like dropping a bag she'd forgotten she was carrying. She pressed both hands to the parapet and leaned forward slightly and looked out at the city and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full, unreasonable weight of wanting to be somewhere else entirely. Not New York, not this party, not this version of her life where everything she did was also a performance of everything she was supposed to be. She was so absorbed in this private dissolution that she didn't notice the other person on the terrace until she heard the sound of a lighter, a click, the brief, warm flare of a flame. Then quiet. She turned. The woman was leaning against the far corner of the parapet with the particular ease of someone who had claimed a space long before anyone else arrived and had no intention of justifying the claim. She was wearing a leather jacket, dark, well-worn, the kind that comes from actual use rather than deliberate distressing, over what appeared to be a simple black tank, and her hair was dark and slightly damp from the rain, pushed back from her face with a carelessness that somehow landed as studied precision. She had one arm resting on the parapet, a cigarette held loosely between 2 fingers, and she was looking at Letitia with an expression that was completely unreadable, and therefore, against all rational judgment, immediately fascinating. She wasn't beautiful in the way that the women inside were beautiful. Carefully assembled, strategically lit, beauty deployed as a professional tool. She was beautiful the way certain photographs are beautiful. A little too much contrast, a little too raw. The kind of image that makes you stop scrolling because something in your peripheral nervous system recognized it before your brain did. Letitia didn't say anything. Neither did the woman. This was, objectively, the beginning of something. Letitia would recognize this later, with the particular clarity that only arrives after events have already happened, when you can trace backward from consequence to cause and see the exact moment the thread was pulled. But in the moment, she only registered. There is a person here, and then, that person is looking at me. And then, more quietly and more alarmingly, I don't want her to stop. Sorry, Letitia said, because someone had to say something. I didn't think anyone else was out here. I noticed, the woman said. Her voice was low, slightly accented. European, Letitia thought, though she couldn't place it precisely. Something central, something with edges. You had the look of someone expecting to be alone. Is that an accusation? The woman smiled. It happened quickly, that smile. It arrived and departed like a weather event, there and gone before you could fully register it, leaving only the afterglow. It's an observation, she said. I collect them. Observations? Among other things. Letitia turned back to the view, mostly because looking at the woman was doing something disorganizing to her thought process, and she needed to recalibrate. The city below moved at its usual impossible pace, lights and motion and the occasional horn, the rhythm of 10,000 separate lives occurring simultaneously. She had always found it both terrifying and steadying, the scale of it. The way it put your own troubles into perspective, not by minimizing them, but by simply demonstrating that trouble was the universal condition, and you were not alone in it, and the city kept moving regardless. You're from the party, the woman said. It wasn't a question. Technically, Letitia said. I'm from Sao Paulo, by way of Rome, by way of here. The party is just where I currently find myself. A pause. Then, that's a precise answer. I'm a precise person. She glanced sideways. Usually. The woman brought the cigarette to her lips, inhaled, exhaled a thin stream of smoke that the rain immediately dispersed. She was looking at the city now too, and Letitia had the odd sensation of having been given permission to look at her properly, to take in the line of her jaw, the slight downward angle of her mouth, that wasn't quite a frown, but lived in that neighborhood, the way she held herself with a kind of settled self-possession that Letitia associated with people who have spent a significant amount of time in their own company and made peace with what they found there. What do you do? The woman asked. At the party, I mean. What's your reason for being there? Art. I'm a curator. And you came here to escape the art party. I came here to remember why I do it, Letitia said, surprising herself. She hadn't known that was what she was going to say until she said it. Sometimes the room gets dense, with the wrong kind of attention, and I need to step back until the thing itself comes back into focus. The woman was quiet for a moment. Letitia waited, unsure what she was waiting for. What's the thing itself? The woman asked finally. The work, Letitia said. What it means. Why it matters. Not who made it or how much it's worth or who it makes you look like if you collect it. Just what it does to you when you stand in front of it and stop performing. The word performing landed in the air between them like something dropped. The woman turned to look at her. Full attention. No deflection. Letitia held it, which surprised her. She was usually the first to look away from that kind of directness, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't offer pretense. But something in the woman's gaze was so fundamentally unsurprised by her, so evidently prepared to simply receive what she said without judgment or translation, that Letitia found she could sustain it. "Do you perform a lot?" the woman asked. "Tonight, almost exclusively." She paused. "Right now feels like the first time I've stopped." It was a vulnerable thing to say to a stranger. Letitia was aware of this even as she said it, aware of the small risk it represented. Not physical, but something more delicate, the particular exposure of saying a true thing out loud to someone whose response you cannot predict. She'd always been careful with that kind of exposure, carefully generous with her professional self, her intellectual self, the self that could discuss Kiefer and Hearst and the politics of institutional collecting with complete fluency. But the self beneath the curator, that one she held closer. The woman studied her for a moment longer. Then she dropped her cigarette and stepped on it with the toe of her boot, and she turned to face Letitia fully. And Letitia felt the shift in the air between them with a physical clarity that was frankly alarming. "I don't know your name," the woman said. "I know." "Does it matter?" The rain was fine and cold against Letitia's arms. The city hummed below them. The party pulsed somewhere behind the glass, insistent and irrelevant. The Edison bulbs were off, and the only light was the refracted glow of Manhattan at night, which meant that the world had narrowed, in this moment, to this small, wet terrace, and this woman who was looking at her like she was something worth looking at. "I don't think it does," Letitia said. "Not right now." The distance between them was perhaps 4 feet, then 3. She wasn't sure who had moved, possibly both of them. Possibly the world had simply contracted slightly, as it sometimes does in the moments before something irreversible happens, as if offering a brief, symbolic narrowing of the space that will soon be closed completely. The woman's hand came up slowly, with the deliberate restraint of someone who has learned to offer rather than take, and her fingers brushed the angle of Letitia's jaw. Barely, a contact so light it might have been the rain. And Letitia had one clear, brief thought, which was, "This is a terrible idea in a way that feels indistinguishable from necessity." And then thought stopped, because the woman's mouth was on hers. The kiss began gently, almost tentative, in the way that a first sentence is sometimes tentative, feeling out the register, the weight, the tone of what you're beginning, rain on their faces, the distant bass line of the party below their feet. Letitia's hands had found the lapels of the leather jacket without her authorizing them to do so, and she held on with a grip that was probably too tight and did not loosen it. And the woman made a sound very low in her throat that was barely audible and entirely devastating. And the kiss deepened in the way that certain conversations deepen, not because anyone decided it, but because the logic of it demanded it, because you'd gone too far in one direction to reasonably reverse. It tasted like rain, and the ghost of tobacco, and something underneath that Letitia couldn't name, something that had the quality of a memory she didn't have yet, an impression of familiarity with a person she'd never met, which was its own kind of impossible, and yet here she was. She didn't know how long it lasted. Time does unreliable things in moments like this, expanding and compressing simultaneously, so that you're aware of every second, and also unable to account for any of them. When they finally separated, both pulling back fractionally, foreheads almost touching, each of them slightly out of breath in a way that neither was going to comment on, Letitia had the sensation of returning to a room she'd stepped out of, finding it altered by her absence. The woman looked at her. There was something in her expression that Letitia wanted to read but couldn't. Something layered. Something that understood more about this moment than she did, which was unsettling, and also perversely made her want to stay in it. "You should go back in," the woman said softly. Letitia blinked. "You're telling me to leave?" "I'm suggesting you have a party to attend." "So do you." The woman smiled again, and this time it stayed a fraction longer, enough for Letitia to see that it reached her eyes. Dark eyes, she registered. Very dark. Holding the neon's reflection in thin, bright lines. "I was never really at the party," she said. And then, before Letitia could respond, before she could say anything at all, the woman turned and walked back through the terrace door, and the party swallowed her whole. And Letitia was left standing in the fine Manhattan rain, with her hands still faintly warm from the leather of a jacket that belonged to a woman whose name she didn't know. She stood out there for another 10 minutes, not from devastation. She was precise enough to recognize that devastation was an overreaction to a single kiss with a beautiful stranger at a party, no matter how extraordinarily that kiss had managed to rearrange her internal furniture. No, she stayed because she needed to re-establish the terms of her own cognition, which had temporarily gone sideways in a direction she hadn't anticipated, and was going to need to think through with some seriousness. Letitia Moretti had been in relationships. Good ones, a few, each one engaged with the full sincerity of someone who believes that love is worth the difficulty. She'd been with women mostly. She'd come to this knowledge in college with the quiet arrival of something that had always been true, and simply needed conditions in which to be recognized. And she'd had one relationship in her late 20s with a sculptor named Daniela that had lasted 2 years, and ended not from failure, but from the particular incompatibility of two. People who love each other, but want incompatible things, which is its own form of grief. She was not a person who kissed strangers on rooftops. She was not a person who said, "I don't think names matter right now," to someone she'd met 5 minutes ago, and then followed the logical conclusion of that sentence with her mouth. She was, apparently, that person. At least tonight. The question was what to do with it. The practical answer was nothing. A kiss at a party with a woman you don't know, and will never see again, is a story you tell yourself later. A small, perfect thing you keep. It had happened. It had been extraordinary. It was over. The sensible architecture of Letitia's life could accommodate it without significant structural damage, provided she treated it as a standalone event, and did not, for instance, go back inside and search the crowd for a dark jacket and eyes that held neon like a mirror. She went back inside. She did not search. She found Leo at the bar, which was where Leo reliably ended up at any party once the networking portion had run its course, and she leaned against the counter beside him and accepted the drink he'd already poured for her, because Leo had a gift for anticipating what people needed before they knew they needed it, which was one of the things that made him an exceptional friend and an infuriating person to try to hide things from. "You disappeared," he said, not accusingly. He was looking at the room with the particular evaluative gaze of an architect at a party, assessing proportions, sight lines, the way human bodies moved through a designed space. "Terrace," she said. "It's raining." "Slightly." He looked at her sideways. Leo Thorne was 31, all long limbs and angular precision, with his father's British bone structure softened by his mother's something warmer and harder to define. He had brown eyes that were very good at noticing things, and a face that he kept carefully neutral when he was paying close attention, so that people often thought he wasn't watching when he was watching most intently. He and Letitia had developed, over 7 years, a private vocabulary of looks and pauses that allowed them to communicate entire paragraphs without speaking. Right now, the look he was giving her said, "Something happened." "I'm fine," she said preemptively. "I didn't ask." The look asked. The look was simply present. You interpreted the rest. He took a sip of his drink. "Did you meet someone?" The question was asked with that particular combination of hope and casualness that friends deploy when they want to know the answer, but are prepared to pretend they don't if the subject wishes to be dropped. Letitia had been on both sides of this conversation enough times to recognize the architecture of it. "No," she said, because it was technically true. She hadn't met anyone, in the sense that meeting implies the establishment of some informational exchange, a name at minimum. She had kissed someone, which was a different thing. "I just needed air." Said Leo, in the tone that meant, I believe, approximately 40% of that. "How was the Bushwick conversation?" "Thorough," he said. Very thorough. The man has opinions about zoning that he wanted to share in comprehensive detail. He set down his glass. I think we can leave in 20 minutes without anyone considering it a statement. Make it 15, Letitia said. He looked at her again. Are you sure you're all right? She smiled, a real one this time, not the professional version, the one that involved her actual face. I'm fine, Leo. I'm just tired of performing. He accepted this, as he always did, without pressing further. One of Leo's most profound gifts as a friend was knowing when inquiry became imposition. He simply nodded and turned back to the room, and Letitia followed his gaze and scanned, briefly and against her better judgment, for a woman in a leather jacket with dark, damp hair. She didn't find her. By the time they left, 15 minutes later, exactly, because Leo was a man who honored timelines. The rain had thickened slightly, and they shared his umbrella down to the street, walking close together in the way of people who have been cold in each other's vicinity enough times that proximity is simply habitual. The city at midnight had its own particular grammar, different from the grammar of midnight anywhere else, sharper and more forgiving simultaneously. How'd the gala receive you? Leo asked as they waited for a cab. As well as galas receive anyone who refuses to play the game properly. She paused. Someone told me to soften my political edge. Leo made a short, dismissive sound. Which someone? Irrelevant. Political edge is the point, Letitia. It's why your work means something. I know. She watched the cab approach. I know it is. Don't let them sand you down, he said. There was something beneath it, something personal. Leo had his own version of this, the architecture world's particular brand of conservative pressure, but he didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to. They said goodnight on the corner. He hugged her briefly and firmly, the way he always did, and she held on a second longer than usual, because sometimes you need the anchor of a person who has known you long enough to see past the performance. And tonight, she was particularly grateful for that anchor. Sunday dinner? He asked. Sunday dinner, she confirmed. She watched him walk toward his building, tall and certain in the rain, and then she turned and walked the other direction, and she thought about dark eyes and a leather jacket, and the particular quality of a kiss that tastes like something you've been missing without knowing you were missing it. And she told herself, firmly, and with the full force of her otherwise reliable, rational mind, that it was over. That it was simply one of those perfect enclosed moments that life occasionally offers, and that are best accepted rather than pursued. She told herself this several times, walking home. She was still telling herself this the next morning, when she was in her apartment in Crown Heights, sitting at her kitchen table with espresso and the week's exhibition notes, trying to think about the Kessler wall placement, and thinking instead about shoulders and a leather jacket. The morning was gray, and the coffee was good, and her apartment was exactly what it had always been. Books stacked in 3 languages, a print of a Richard Serra drawing above the desk, the faint smell of turpentine from the small oil she'd been attempting for personal pleasure and not yet succeeded at. And it was ordinary in the way that made the previous night feel slightly unreal, the way dreams feel unreal in the immediate sensory evidence of morning. Her phone buzzed. Leo. Hey, minor change of plan for Sunday. Can you come Saturday instead? Doing a dinner, not a big thing, just want you there. 7 p.m. She typed back, Sure. Is this a thing or a thing? His response came quickly. A thing. My sister's in town. Letitia set the phone down. She picked it up again. Leo's sister. She searched her mental files, which were comprehensive on the subject of Leo Thorne, but notably sparse on the subject of his family, specifically because Leo was sparse on the subject of his family. She knew the broad outline. His parents were British American. His father a lawyer, his mother a professor of something classical. The family was old money in the old money sense that includes the particular coldness that old money tends to breed in households where warmth has been crowded out by expectation. She knew there was a sister, older by 2 or 3 years, she thought, and she knew there had been some kind of rift, The kind of family rupture that people reference obliquely and without detail, because the full version is either too painful or too complicated to be delivered in passing. And she had respected this, the way she respected all of Leo's silences on the subject of his family, with the tact of a person who understands that some histories are not offered until they're ready to be given. The sister had been in Europe. Germany, she thought. Berlin. She stared at the text. Something was pulling at the edge of her attention, something inconclusive and irrational, a pattern recognition system in her brain firing quietly in a direction she was choosing not to follow. She typed back, looking forward to it, and set the phone face down, and picked up the Kessler notes, and applied herself to them with the focused determination of someone who suspects that if they look up, something they aren't ready to see will be there. Saturday arrived with the brisk efficiency of late autumn New York, which does not ease you into the season, but presents it to you fully formed and expects you to adapt. Letitia walked the 2 blocks from the subway to Leo's building in Cobble Hill, with her coat pulled close and her mind running over the list of things she needed to discuss with him. The Whitmore Spring Program, the emerging artist she'd been tracking from Bushwick, the grant application that was due in 3 weeks and required a co-signature from the institution's board. She brought wine, a Sicilian red she'd been told was excellent and was prepared to judge for herself, and a small cactus she'd acquired from the farmer's market for reasons she chose not to examine, because Leo always had plants in his apartment and she liked the idea of adding to the collection. She was thinking about none of this when Leo opened the door. She was thinking about the Whitmore Spring Program. Or she had been. The thought evacuated immediately when she looked past Leo's shoulder into the apartment and saw, standing at his kitchen island with a glass of water, a woman in a leather jacket. Dark, well-worn, the kind that comes from actual use. The woman looked up. Their eyes met across the length of Leo's apartment, over his shoulder, past the books and the drafting table, and the low lamp that Leo kept burning even in daylight, because he said it improved the quality of thinking in a space. They met with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like geometry, the inevitable intersection of 2 lines that have been converging from a distance you couldn't see from either end. The woman's expression did several things simultaneously. Letitia's expression was probably doing the same, though she was less aware of her own face in this moment than she was of the specific, cold, very clear sensation of the world rearranging itself around a fact she hadn't known to expect. "Letitia," Leo said, warm and pleased, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in. I want you to meet my sister. She's finally back from Berlin." He gestured. "Valeria, this is my best friend, Letitia Moretti." "Letitia, this is Valeria." Valeria Thorne. Because that was her name. That was who she was. That was what the universe had apparently decided to do with the information it was holding. Extended her hand. Letitia shook it. The contact lasted approximately 2 seconds. Professional, brief, entirely appropriate to the circumstances of meeting your best friend's sister for the first time. Valeria's hand was warm, and her grip was firm, and her expression, this close, was carefully composed, which told Letitia, who was very good at reading faces, that considerable effort was being expended on that composure. "Nice to meet you," Valeria said. Her voice was low, slightly accented. European. Something central. Something with edges. "You too," Letitia said. Her own voice came out level, which she considered a personal achievement of some magnitude. "Leo's mentioned you." "Has he?" said Valeria, and it was not quite a question. "Almost never," Letitia said, because she was not, in this moment, capable of anything but the truth, and because there was something in the slight tightening at the corner of Valeria's mouth that suggested she would appreciate honesty over courtesy, which I've always thought meant the subject mattered more than he let on. Leo, who had moved to the kitchen and was doing something with a pot that smelled of garlic and white wine, called back, "I can hear you, you know." "We know," Letitia said, and Valeria smiled. That quick, weather event smile she recognized, the one that arrived and departed before you could fully register it. And Letitia thought, with the particular calm of someone watching a structure they've built begin to fracture, I am in tremendous trouble. The apartment held the three of them in the particular way that small spaces hold complicated dynamics, by forcing proximity, which enforces a kind of intimacy whether you've chosen it or not. Leo's dining table sat 6 but was set for 3, which meant that the geometry of their arrangement, Letitia across from Valeria, Leo at the head, created direct lines of sight that were occasionally, inescapably unavoidable. Leo cooked well, which was something Letitia had always loved about him. His architecture extended to food, the same precision applied to the construction of a meal that he gave to the construction of a building. Tonight, it was pasta with clams and a salad that had more going on in it than it advertised, and bread from the Cobble Hill bakery that left flour on your fingers. The wine was open. The lamp was burning. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent and eternal. Conversation, to Letitia's complicated relief, came easily enough that the effort required to produce it wasn't visible. Leo talked about the Bushwick project, the planning commission meeting he had the following week, the client who kept changing his mind about the entrance sequence. He talked the way he always talked, with enthusiasm and precision, the words chosen carefully but not self-consciously, the way a craftsman uses tools they know well. Valeria listened. This was something Letitia noticed, filed, tried not to assign too much weight to. That Valeria was an excellent listener, not the performed attentiveness of someone waiting to speak, but the real thing. The kind of listening that involves looking at you steadily and not filling silences. The kind that makes the speaker feel, for the duration of being heard, that what they are saying matters exactly as much as they hoped it did. She asked good questions, too. About the Bushwick project. What's the relationship between the residential and commercial spaces? How did you arrive at that balance? About Letitia's work. The Whitmore. Is it primarily contemporary, or do you range into historical work? The questions weren't conversational placeholders. They were genuine inquiry, and they were smart, and Letitia found herself answering them with more detail than she'd planned, drawn in by the quality of the attention. Valeria's a photographer, Leo offered, between the pasta and the salad, with the slightly too careful casualness of someone sharing information they're monitoring the reception of. I know, Letitia said, and then corrected. That makes sense. She looked at Valeria. What kind of work? Documentary, mostly, Valeria said. I was in Berlin for 5 years, working on a long project about urban migration, the way people rebuild identity in transit. She paused, turning her wine glass slightly. How the places we leave shape the places we become. The statement landed with a weight that Letitia recognized as double, personal and professional simultaneously. She didn't reach for the personal layer. It wasn't hers to touch. But she responded to the artistic one, which was accessible and real. That's exactly what good documentary work does, I think, she said. It doesn't document the place. It documents the person in relation to the place. The place is almost incidental. It's the point of contact, not the point. Valeria looked at her. Yes, she said, quiet and direct. Exactly. Leo was watching them both. Letitia could feel it without looking at him directly. The fine calibration of his attention, the way he held his glass without drinking. She had the sudden, disquieting awareness that she was in a situation where all the information she was generating was available to a person who knew her better than almost anyone, and that this was a dangerous environment for a secret she hadn't yet decided she was keeping. How long are you in New York? Letitia asked, aiming for lightness and landing somewhere adjacent to it. I don't know yet, Valeria said. Her eyes were dark in the lamplight, holding things quietly. I came back to reassess, to see what's still here. There was a silence that was 2 seconds long and felt longer. "Good time of year for it," Letitia said, which was meaningless but serviceable. Said Leo, and took a sip of his wine, and Letitia could feel that he was filing something away. Dinner ended at 10. Leo made coffee, small cups, the way he'd learned from his years of working with Italian firms during his graduate studies. The kind of coffee that is a statement of affection delivered in thimble form. They drank it in the living room with the city visible below, and the conversation had moved, by this point, into the easier territory of shared references. Films they'd seen, exhibitions that had recently opened, a building in Brooklyn that Leo had strong opinions about, and that Valeria, it turned out, had photographed 6 weeks ago without knowing it was Leo's. "The corner entrance," she said, pulling out her phone and showing him. "I was shooting the neighborhood, just walking. The light on the brickwork at 4 in the afternoon does this thing." Leo looked at the photo, and his face did something complicated. "That's the one they almost approved with a different cladding," he said. "The brick was a fight. I'm glad you caught it." Valeria smiled, looking at her own photograph. There was something in the way she looked at her work. Unsentimental, and still clearly invested, a relationship with the image that was both critical and caring, that Letitia recognized from her own relationship with the objects in her exhibitions. The curator's version of the same instinct, love of the thing, insistence on its being seen properly. She stayed another half hour, because leaving immediately felt too pointed, and because the coffee was good, and the company, despite everything, was easy in a way she hadn't anticipated. When she finally put on her coat and picked up her bag, Leo walked her to the door with the unnecessary but familiar gesture of walking someone out to the elevator, even though they could clearly find it themselves. Valeria had stayed in the living room, scrolling through photographs on her phone. "She's different than I expected," Letitia said, quietly in the hallway. Leo was quiet for a moment. "Different how?" "I don't know. I didn't have a specific expectation." She paused. "You don't talk about her much. It's complicated." He said it simply, without defensiveness, which meant it was a real thing rather than a polite deflection. "Okay," Letitia said, because she could hear the boundary in his voice and she respected it. "I'm glad she's back." Something flickered across Leo's face. Relief and concern in roughly equal measure. The particular compound expression of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is newly uncertain whether getting it will be as simple as wanting it. "Yeah," he said. "Me too, I think." She hugged him goodnight. In the elevator going down, she stood very still and looked at her reflection in the mirrored door and noted, dispassionately, that she looked exactly like herself and that no external evidence of the last 48 hours was visible. This was, she supposed, something. On the street, she turned up her collar against the cold and walked toward the subway, and she was 2 blocks away and descending the stairs when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't have saved. "A New York area code. You forgot your cactus." She stopped on the subway stairs. V. She stood there for 5 seconds, which is a long time to stand on subway stairs in Brooklyn on a Saturday night with people flowing around you like water around a rock. And then she typed back, "I left it on purpose," which was not true, and then deleted that, and then typed, "Save it for me, I'll be back," which was true, and sent it before she could deliberate further. She pocketed her phone and went down into the station and waited for the train, and did not let herself think about what she'd just written, or what it implied, or the fact that she had just given her phone number, in practical terms, to the woman she'd kissed in the rain at a party 3 days ago who turned out to be her best friend's sister. She did not think about any of this. The train came. She got on. Manhattan disappeared behind the river. Valeria Thorne, she thought, despite her best efforts. Valeria. She looked out the dark tunnel window at her own reflection, and somewhere beneath the curator and the professional, and the woman who always knew what to do. Something unfamiliar had taken up residence. Not panic exactly, and not quite joy, but something that shared a border with both. The train moved. The city moved. Outside the window, nothing but darkness and the past, rushing by.